Next transaction, the business completed a marketing consulting service to a newly established business for 50,000 pesos. The business collected 20,000 pesos and a balance to be received next month. What are the accounts affected? The first account affected is cash because the business received cash. The other account affected is accounts receivable because the business has a collectible. Not the full amount was collected, so the business has a collectible. We can use the accounts receivable account in order to record the collectible. The third account affected is consulting revenue because there's an income. The business had completed a marketing consulting service. We are going to use the consulting revenue account to record the income. What is the effect of the transaction to cash? Cash increased by 20,000 pesos because the business collected 20,000 pesos out of 50,000 pesos. Accounts receivable is increased by 30,000 pesos because there is a collectible next month. Consulting revenue increased by 50,000 pesos because this is the full amount of the service completed by the business. Just to review what we had discussed in our previous lessons, income is recorded once service is completed or goods are delivered, whether cash is received immediately or not. We call this accrual accounting. Accrual accounting is recording income when it is earned, whether the business received cash or whether the business has a receivable or collectible. Next transaction, the business rendered a consulting service on credit to a retail store amounting to 25,000 pesos. What are the accounts affected? The first account affected is accounts receivable because the business rendered a consulting service on credit, so meaning to say there's a collectible. The other account affected is consulting revenue. The business completed a consulting service, so there's an income. The business can use the consulting revenue to record the income. What is the effect of the transaction to accounts receivable? Accounts receivable increased by 25,000 since there is a collectible. Consulting revenue increased by the same amount, 25,000 pesos, because the business had rendered or completed a consulting service. Next transaction, the business paid the monthly installment for the purchase of tables, chairs, and cabinets last March 6. What are the accounts affected? There's a payment for cash, so definitely cash is affected. The other account involved in this transaction is accounts payable because there's a payment of the monthly installment, meaning to say the monthly payable pertaining to the purchase of tables, chairs, and cabinets. What is the effect of the transaction to cash? There's a payment, so cash will decrease by 5,000 pesos. So since it's a payment of a payable, accounts payable will be decreased by the same amount. Next transaction, the business received 40,000 pesos in advance from a client for a marketing consulting engagement. What are the accounts affected? The first account affected is cash because the business received cash. The other account affected is unearned revenue, a liability account, because the business received a cash and advance payment from a client for a future consulting engagement. That is why we need to record a liability. What is the effect of the transaction to cash? Cash is increased by 40,000 pesos. What is the effect of the transaction to unearned revenue? Unearned revenue is increased by the same amount because no service has been rendered or completed yet. So the business has to record a liability and unearned revenue. Next transaction, the business completed a consulting service for a manufacturing company for 50,000 pesos. 50% was collected and the balance to be received next month. What are the accounts affected? The first account affected is cash because half of the service fee was collected. The second account affected is accounts receivable because half of the service fee will be collected or received next month. So there's a collectible, so there's a receivable. The last account affected is consulting revenue. Since the business completed a consulting service, there's an income, so we're going to record the income in the consulting revenue account. What is the effect of the transaction to cash? Cash is increased by 25,000 pesos, equal to the 50% of the service fee collected. Accounts receivable is increased by 25,000 pesos as well, because a portion of 50,000 pesos will be collected next month, so there's a collectible. Consulting revenue is increased by 50,000 pesos because there is an income. The business completed a consulting service, the business will recognize an income. Consulting revenue increases owner's equity, so consulting revenue will have a positive amount, 50,000 pesos. Next transaction, the business paid the water bill for the month 300 pesos. What accounts are affected? The first account affected is cash because there's a payment. The other account affected is utilities expense. We can use this account to record the receipt of the water bill. What is the effect of the transaction to cash? Cash is decreased by 300 pesos, equal to the payment for the water bill. What is the effect of the transaction to utilities expense? Utilities expense is increased. So any increase in utilities expense will decrease owner's equity. So that is why we have a negative amount under owner's equity for utilities expense. Next transaction, the business paid the salary of the assistant 4,000 pesos. What accounts are affected? The first account affected is cash because there's a payment. The other account affected is salaries expense. We can use this account to record the salary of employees. What is the effect of the transaction to cash? Cash is decreased by 4,000 pesos because the business paid 4,000 pesos for the assistant's salary. What is the effect of the transaction to salaries expense? Salaries expense is increased. Since salaries expense decreases owner's equity, so we are going to show 4,000 as a negative amount. Next transaction, the business collected a 25,000 account of the retail store. Now you can refer to the transaction on March 17 in order to review the details of that transaction. What accounts are affected? The first account affected is cash because there's a collection. The second account affected is accounts receivable because there's a collection of an account. When we say collection of an account, we are actually referring to a collection of an accounts receivable. So what is the effect of the transaction to cash? Cash is increased by 25,000 pesos because there's a collection for the same amount. Accounts receivable is decreased every time we collect or a business collects an accounts receivable, the accounts receivable is decreased. When accounts receivable is collected, there is no more receivable. So this is again an example of a transaction affecting only assets. An increase in cash and an asset with a corresponding decrease in another asset, accounts receivable. So it's just converting an accounts receivable into cash because the receivable was collected. Next transaction, Mr. Pamintuan attended a seminar in Manila. The cost of transportation and accommodation are 1,700 pesos and 1,500 pesos respectively. Please take note, the attendance of Mr. Pamintuan to this seminar in Manila is related to the business. That is why this is a business transaction. What accounts are affected? The first account affected is cash because there's a payment. The other account affected is traveling expense. We can use this account to record the cost of transportation and accommodation. What is the effect of the transaction to the cash account? Cash is decreased by 3,200 because there's a payment, 1,700 plus 1,500. What is the effect of the transaction to traveling expense? Traveling expense is increased. So any increase in traveling expense will decrease owner's equity. That is why we have a negative amount, 3,200 for traveling expense. Next transaction, Mr. Pamintuan withdrew 2,000 pesos for personal use. What accounts are affected? The first account affected is cash because there's a withdrawal of cash from the business. The other account affected is Pamintuan withdrawals. We can use this account to record any withdrawal of cash or investment from the business by the owner. What is the effect of this transaction to cash? Cash is decreased by 2,000 pesos because the owner withdrew 2,000 pesos for personal use. What is the effect of this transaction to Pamintuan withdrawals? Pamintuan withdrawals increase because there's a withdrawal. And what is the effect of Pamintuan withdrawals to owner's equity? Any withdrawal decreases owner's equity. So that is why Pamintuan withdrawals is shown with a negative 2,000 amount. Next transaction, the business received 8,000 pesos for a business consulting service. The accounts affected are cash, because the business received cash, and consulting revenue, because there's a completion of a business consulting service. What is the effect of the transaction to cash? Cash is increased by 8,000 pesos because the business received 8,000 pesos for the completion of the business consulting service. Since there is a completion of a service or a consulting service, the business should recognize an income. That is why there is an increase in the consulting revenue account. What is the effect of an increase in income or increase in consulting revenue? Owner's equity is increased. So that is why consulting revenue has a positive amount for 8,000 pesos. Last transaction, the business received the electric bill amounting to 1,000 pesos. What accounts are affected? The first account affected is utilities expense. When the business received the electric bill, it means utilities expense had already been incurred. The other account affected is utilities payable. Please take note, the receipt of electric bill does not mean payment of electric bill. So there is no statement in this transaction that says that the business had already paid the electric bill. So there is a payable. So we can use the utilities payable account in order to show that the business has a payable to the electricity provider. What is the effect of the transaction to utilities expense? Utilities expense increase. What is the effect of an increase in utilities expense to owner's equity? Owner's equity is decreased. That is why the utilities expense under the owner's equity column is shown with a negative amount for 1,000 pesos. What is the effect of the transaction to utilities payable? So, since there is a payable, there is an increase in utilities payable. Utilities payable is increased by 1,000 pesos. Expenses recorded once an asset or service is used or consumed, whether cash is paid immediately or not. Again, this is called accrual accounting, just what we had discussed about income. Accrual accounting is when we record expense when we incur it, whether we had already paid cash or we still have a payable.